Okay, all right. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So this is a continuation of our introduction to Maliki Fiqh. So this is a continuation of our new class, Introduction to Maliki Fiqh. Fiqh is a Arabic term that we use for the study of how do we perform various acts of worship as Muslims. So when we say we're Muslims and that we believe in Allah and that we pray, we fast, we do, well, how do you pray as a Muslim? How do you fast as a Muslim? How do you eat? How do you go to the bathroom? How do you do virtually any aspect of religious life? Then we have this concept here. When we say fiqh, what we really mean is what? The study of how to live as Muslims and how to worship Allah. That's really the meaning of the word. Of course, the linguistic meaning of the word fiqh means to comprehend. So in the first session, again, if there's two sessions that are already up on YouTube. So if you missed them, you can go back. I've tried to make them, fairly short. In terms of the class might go like an hour or 45, but I've tried to make the material that we cover in the class pretty short and concise. So if you miss a class, it's easy to go back over and kind of, get caught up. Also, the way that the book that we're reading from, the text that we're reading from, it's meant to be very cursory, very economic, terse in the language. So it's easy to follow along. So we were in the chapter talking about Babul A'yani, al-Ṭahārah wa A'yan najasa. We were in the chapter that was dealing with substances that are pure or impure. And by that, substances meaning there could be organic substances like a living thing, or inorganic substances like rocks or water. So some things are pure and some things are impure. The part that we left off on is going to go back and talk about, just quickly to backtrack, we talked about what certain kinds of animals generally are considered pure, even if they are impure to eat. So if you remember, we said that what, for pig, for instance, we cannot eat pigs, but pig itself is considered pure. Meaning, like, if I touch a pig, I don't have to wash myself in, any kind of special way, right? So there's a difference between what is acceptable to eat and does it in and of itself cause me or negate me to be in a state of purity. Purity is important because in order to be able to perform certain acts as a Muslim, particularly certain acts of devotion, like the prayer, when we want to pray, we have to have what we call ritual purity, or to be in a state of ritual purity, what we call in Arabic ṭahārah. And so there are certain things that we may do, like if we go use the bathroom, if we pass wind, if we fall into a deep sleep, and so on. Those things will cause us to have a minor form of impurity that can be corrected through a type of ritual washing known as wudu. That's where you see people wash, they perform a kind of ritual washing known in ablution, but nobody really uses that word or knows it anymore, right? But that's a type of minor impurity that those things will cause. Then there are types of impurities that prohibit one from being pure. Like if you use the bathroom and you have urine on you, or if you use the bathroom and you have feces on you, or there's some type of impure substance on your clothing, on your body, or even in the place of prayer, then we cannot perform the prayer. And so then we have to remove those types of impurities so that we can obtain purification. So those are the two main things. I had sent out a little, maybe at the end of the class, I'll drop the little infographic that I made to explain that. Now we're going to go back and we're going to look at more things about particularly substances that emerge from the body. So al-Majjājī, rahimahullah, may Allah have mercy on him, he writes, وَمَا يَخْرُجُ مِنْ جَسَدِ الْحَيِّ. So anything that comes out of the body of a living animal, a living thing, min araq, whether that be things such as sweat, or dam', or tears, like from crying, or lu'ab, saliva, wa mukhat, or even mucus, like if you blow your nose, right? Mucus. None of those are impure. So I don't know. I don't know if you have any kids. I have a dog. Like when you have a baby, maybe the baby's gets a cold and like you got to clean up, and your kid gets, it might be nasty personally, right? To have to clean up, or you ever hold people like, here, hold my baby, baby starts slobbering all over you, like, right? Now that might not be pleasant, but that doesn't say, oh man, that baby slobbered all over me, I gotta go make wudu. I gotta go, right, renew my state of purification so I can pray. No problem. So he says what? وَمَا يَخْرُجُ مِنْ جَسَدِ الْحَيِّ مِنَ الْعَرَقِ وَالدَّمَعِ وَاللُّعَابِ وَمُخَاطٍ فَهُوَ طَاهِرٌ بِطَهَارَةِ أَصْلِهِ. So all of those things, they're pure in and of themselves. Tears, saliva, mucus, sweat, not a problem. And therefore, connected to that, sweating does not cause you to break your ṭahārah. Sweating does not, like you go out and you run, like this might happen, right? You might go, let's say you go to the gym and you work out, or you're outside working and, oh man, I'm all sweaty and nasty, how we feel, right? And it's like, oh man, I need to pray, because the prayer, like in Islam, you have to pray at certain times. And let's say like you're right towards the very end of Dhuhr before Asr begins, and you would miss the prayer and be late, which is sinful. So you have a choice. Do I pray sweaty, even though I might be in a state of purity? Do I pray sweaty and make the prayer on time? Or do I delay my prayer and take a shower and get all nice and clean, but then be late for the prayer? What would you do? You pray sweaty, right? So again, or if you were crying, maybe you were really upset, you heard some terrible news and you're crying, like not to the point you lost your mind, but you're just sad, you're crying. That doesn't invalidate your state of purification. And same thing. Let's say you were sick and you're, oh man, I'm feeling sick and I have a bad head cold and I'm blowing my nose and I got all of this mucus coming out of me. It might not be enjoyable, but it doesn't invalidate, right? It doesn't invalidate one's purity. He says, now what them? Yes, alaikum salam.
So let's say I'm out in the yard and I'm working, and I'm working with sweat and clothes get dingy, my clothes get dirty and whatnot. At that point, and let's say that I'm not close to the time of salat going down, right? At that point, obviously my clothes are filthy. I need to put clean clothes on. I need to.
Well, define dirty, right? We talked about this last time. Like dirt in itself is pure.
All right, let's say that I don't know how this would happen, but I have animals.
Yeah,
right.
We're gonna actually get to that in just a second.
And I either stepped in something or something that's najis, right? So, but
is it najis? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. That's what I'm saying. Because I want to move on. I want to just look very quickly. We must differentiate between dirty in terms of how we feel and dirty shara'an, dirty in terms of what does, because there's no idea of dirty in the Sharia. There's no idea of being dirty in terms of in the laws that God has revealed of how to worship Him and not. That's a personal. I was out gardening. I was out mowing the lawn. You said you work in construction, right? I'm all sweaty and it's 108 degrees or whatever. Okay, you might be dirty, and that could be unpleasant. But there's no idea, there's no concept of being dirty in Islam in the idea of what is acceptable to pray or not. Now, preferable, Dhuhr started at 12:01 and it's 12:18, and I just got through with my shift, and I got plenty of time. I can take a shower, up, change my clothes, right? I can do all those things. That's perfectly fine, right? But it doesn't necessitate. Now, again, we also have to understand, particularly in the school of thought related to the Malikiyya, the prayer every prayer is divided up into two times. Al-Mukhtar wa al-Dururi, right? There is the earlier time. So every time the prayer comes in, say Fajr, let's say the morning prayer comes in at 4:50 and it goes out at 6 o'clock. So you have from 4:50 to 6 a.m. to pray it. But Imam Malik said what? The earlier time is the better time to pray it, right? You can pray it later, but it's earlier to pray it. And so unnecessarily delaying it, though we can't say it's a sin, right? So there's more reward for praying it early. So again, these are things that you will have to navigate and decide for your own, but keeping in mind, there is no concept of dirty in Islam, right? There is pure and impure. Dirt is pure, right? Dirt is pure. You can pray, like people, you come in the masjid and the first thing people say is, well, take off your shoes. Okay. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't take off our shoes in the masjid because, yeah, it certainly makes things more pleasant. And I would prefer not to pray on the ground where there's been a bunch of shoes walking because I prefer not to put my face on that. But there's a difference between that and saying that you cannot wear shoes in the masjid like there's a commandment. This doesn't exist. And the idea that you have to pray on a rug. Sure, I would like to pray on a rug for many reasons. It's soft, it's clean, it's nice. But if it's time to pray and and it's like, oh man, I got 8 minutes to do the prayer, otherwise I'm going to be in a state of sin, of missing the prayer. I got to pray on whatever's there as long as it is not impure. Now, I might have to pray in the mud, I might have to pray in the dirt, I might have to pray whatever, right? So that's a difference, right? So the idea of dirty doesn't really exist in terms of the Sharia, in terms of the laws, what govern how to do acts of prayer, right? We throw out the word dirty and we replace it with either pure or impure, ṭahārah or najasa, right? There's only these two exist. So as it relates to animals, we'll see in a minute. So we said what? Number one, any substance that comes out of a living thing. Now he didn't say min al-hayawan al-adami. He didn't say from humans, but from animals, any living thing. So what we're talking about, sweat, tears, saliva, mucus. It might be nasty, but it doesn't invalidate one's purity, and therefore one can pray if you happen to be in that situation. Now let's get to ad-dam, blood. He says, as it relates to blood and whether or not it's pure, impure, right? He says, ad-dam min masfuh aw ghayr masfuh. So whether it's blood that's been spilled or not, then it is the first type, fal-awwal najas. The first type is impure. And it is the kind that he says, wal-qayh, like pus, wal-sadid, right? And any kind of discharge, including like when women are on their menstrual period, right? The sadid, right? That part is what is najas. It's impure. But he says, وَالثَّانِي لَهُ حُكْمَ الطَّاهِرِ. But rather, the latter is considered pure. So if you have, let's say I'm in the kitchen, I'm cooking, and oh man, I cut myself. Now, if I bleed an excessive amount, yes, that breaks my wudu. But the blood in and of itself is not considered to be impure, right? So bleeding over a certain amount invalidates you being in a state of purity, and then you have to essentially stop the bleeding and then repeat your wudu, repeat your purity, right? But let's say the same scenario. I cut myself. All right, I bleed out enough that, okay, I got to make wudu. I got to go into a state of ritual purity again. But, you know, I got my bandage over it, and I might get a little bit of bleeding. Not enough to break my wudu, but a little bit of blood might still come out, and I'm going to go pray. Does that invalidate my prayer? As long as it's generally pure, and I don't have an infection, there's no pus, there's no this or that, not a problem. This is important, right? So it's ad-dam min masfuh wa ghayri masfuh fal-awwal najas, right? So whether the blood is something associated like either with an infection or some other type of discharge from the body other than pure bleeding, then that kind can be impure. But he says, وَالثَّانِي لَهُ حُكْمُ الطَّاهِرِ. But otherwise, it's treated as being pure. وَفَضَلَاتِ الْأَدَمِ. Now, as we get to the types of excretions, particularly from humans, وَفَضَلَاتِ الْأَدَمِ مِنْ بَوْلٍ وَرَجِيعٍ وَالْمَذْيٌ وَوَدْيٌ وَمَنِّ نَجَسًا. So now things that are excreted from the body, like urine or feces, right, or vomit, ar-raji', or in the case of sexual relations or the sexual organs, either the pre-ejaculated fluid or prostatic fluid or semen, all of those are considered impure. So if they are, obviously, if you ejaculate, like if you have sexual relations or you have a wet dream or whatever that it is, then not only are you in a state of major impurity, but if for whatever reason, if you have that on your clothes, it has to get removed or on the body. And so now we're going to look at a statement of the wife of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We're going to look at a statement from Aisha, al-Mu'mineen, and she's going to tell us about an instance of where, how she dealt with this specific scenario. And this is important too, because I don't know why, but sometimes when you talk about sex with Muslims or even religious people in general, people get all bottled up. But we will see, actually, a man came and stayed and lodged at the house where Aisha was at, and they discussed this very same thing about, because it's a natural thing between men and women. She states, Kuntu aglisuhu min thawbi Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. I used to wash sometimes semen off of the clothing of the Messenger of Allah, because what? He was my husband. She was married to the Prophet Muhammad. They had sexual relations. And so what? She said sometimes that it would get on their clothing. So she had to wash the clothing. فَيَخْرُجُ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ وَأَثَرَ الْغَسْلِ فِي ثَوْبِهِ نُقِعُ الْمَاءِ أَخْرَجَهُ الشَّيْخَانِ. So in the hadith, she said, I used to wash sometimes after having sexual relations with the Prophet. I had to wash his clothes and get that off of there. And he would go out to perform the prayer while there were still some wet water spots on his clothing, right? I mean, it hadn't completely dried yet, right? The semen, right, the sexual fluid was removed, but the garment hadn't completely dried yet. And he went out to perform the prayer, showing that, one, the performance of the prayer is a massive thing. Like, it's a major important thing. And that a lot of times, sure, it's nice to be all super, spick and span clean, but prayer takes a priority over a great many things. I don't say everything, but a great many things. And so the Prophet ﷺ, who we knew was keen on his appearance, he kept himself well groomed, and he encouraged people, like on Friday, wear your best clothes, and on and on and on. But, hey, it's time to pray. And so he would have to go out to lead the prayer. And we also know that he didn't have a massive wardrobe. And so the most important thing is he has to be in a state of purity. His clothes and his body have to be clean. He has to be pure. But, all right, you can still see where some washing took place. But the need to pray superseded everything needing to be perfect. And so when you were asking before about, well, you got this and that or whatnot, no. It's also to remember that prayer is an obligation that has few dispensations. Right? That's the importance here on one of the takeaways to remember. So she says, وَأَثَرَ الْغَسْلِ فِي ثَوْبِهِ. You can still see the remnants of the washing on his clothes when he went out to perform prayer. بُقَعُ الْمَاءِ. You could still see where the water was. وَأَخْرَجَهُ الشَّيْخَيْنِ. And this is related in Sahih Muslim and Bukhari. Continuing, أخرج al-Bukhari wa Muslim. Both of them relate this. But in particular, al-Lafz li-Muslim, rahimahullah, particularly the narration of the wording from Imam Muslim on Aqlama wal Aswad, according to the two transmitters of it. He said, وَأَنَّ رَجُلًا نَزْرَ بِعَائِشَةَ. A man came and lodged at where the house of where Aisha was. فَأَصْبَحَ. And he woke up in the morning. يَغْلِسُ ثَوْبَ. Washing his clothes. فَقَالَتْ عَائِشَةَ إِنَّمَا كَانَ يُجْزِئَكَ إِنْ رَأَيْتَ إِنْ تَغْلِسْ مَكَانَهُ. it would have been enough for you just simply to wash your clothing only in the spots where you saw that it may have gotten some of the fluid on it, right? That you didn't have to necessarily wash the entire garment to fulfill the obligation of prayer. Nobody's saying you can't wash your clothes altogether. Like you have relations with your spouse, you get something on your clothes. Nobody's saying that, oh, you shouldn't just throw the whole thing in the washing machine. It's not what's not being said. What is being said is, in order to fulfill the obligation of prayer, which is a major obligation, that you will have to make an analysis. Do I got enough time to wash these clothes and put them back on before the prayer is either excessively delayed or even worse, goes out? Or, can I change clothes? Let's say just in a set of circumstances. Again, these people lived in a time, not like us, where they just had like a walk-in closet and 18 billion pairs of clothes. It's like they might have, like, that's it. I got one set of clothes. And so that's why we're getting this kind of detail that, look, you got one pair of clothes. The obligation of the prayer doesn't care how many changes of clothes you got. It just means you have to be pure. Impurities must be removed from the body, the clothing, and the place of prayer. And as it relates to the clothing, just spot clean it. If I were to get some bodily sexual fluid on this part, right, I just got to clean this part. I didn't got to clean the whole joint. Now, I may want that, but then I have to, well, do I have time to do all that? So that's why we're getting, and they're mentioning this here. وَإِن لَمْ تَرَى نَضْحَةَ حَوْلَ وَلَقَدْ رَأَيْتُنِي أَفْرُقُهُ مِنْ ثَوْبِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. So if you do not see exactly where it is, then sprinkle some water around the place where you think that it is, because water, we said, it is what? It is mutahhir. Water is that which grants impurity, and what is the muzil? It removes impurities. So also just by sprinkling some water around it and no longer seeing its presence, it's good. You have people that will say, like, you shouldn't wear shoes in the masjid because people go into the bathroom, and in a Western bathroom, particularly men, they stand and they urinate and they pee, and it gets all everything, and then the people walk their shoes in it, and then they track it. That's great. I don't have a problem with that as a preemptive measure, just to keep things nice and tidy. But to say that if somebody wore their shoes in the masjid, though we cannot see any trace of urine or proof of that on the shoe, we might think that it's on there, but unless we can demonstrate it, this is not sufficient to say that we cannot perform the prayer, or that the rugs must be cleaned in order for the prayer to be performed. This is, hopefully you're all kind of understanding, right, what I'm saying. So she says, radiallahu anha, may Allah be pleased with her, right? In lam tara nadahta hawla. If you do not see the stain or the impurity, walaqad ra'aytuni, then you may sprinkle afrakuhu min thawbi Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? Then you'll many times I have seen myself scrubbing the garment, right? So you could pray, just generally getting it clean, spot washing it, doing it in the places, applying water and so on. Again, in our day and age today, where we all have umpteen numbers of clothes to change in, fine. There's nothing saying you can't change your clothes and wash those clothes later. It's just about, can you do that and fulfill the obligation of prayer? Not, then these are obviously the important steps to follow. So Al-Qurtubi says in his book Al-Mufhim, قال القرطبي في المفهم لا حجة في هذا الحديث. There's no argument or complaint about this particular hadith. لمن تمسك به في طهارة المني لو وجهين. He said that there's no argument in this hadith for those who insist on further washing. However, there's two aspects to consider. One, أحدهما أنما ذكرت ذلك محتجة به على قطيها. So he says one of them is that Aisha mentions that this is a proof that she did, like she undertook this methodology, just spot washing it, just getting it off, can't see it, sprinkle some water around it. She did this what? In the presence of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is very important, because this hadith, it's not qala Rasulullah alayhi salam. It's not the Prophet said A, B, and C, or X, Y, and Z. It's what Aisha said, but she's doing it in his presence. And so this is another important type of hadith where a person did a thing and the Prophet did not reprimand them or correct them or change them in anything. And so he lends his tacit approval for this being something acceptable. بأنه لا يجزئ فيه إلى الغسل. And so that he did this in the present, and the verdict was that only washing what is visible, فيما يرئى منه, that it's sufficient. You want to do more? Okay, but again, we cannot make the argument that it's even better. Well, it would be better if you did this. No, there's no proof for that. That's what al-Qurtubi is saying. That's one of the takeaways. وَالنَّضَحْ, and then also moistening what is not visible. So وَالنَّضْحُ فِيمَا لَمْ يُرَى لا تتقرر حجتها إلا بإذن تكون فرتكاها. This is what that only moistening what is not visible, her argument can only be established if she rubbed and scrubbed with water. Not just rubbing and scrubbing like dry rubbing, but in order for the rubbing to be sufficient, then the water has to be applied to it. والثاني, then the second point is إنها قد نصت في الطريق الأخرى. Then he said the second point is that she, meaning Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, stated in another narration, أن رسول الله كان يغلس المني, that the Prophet used to wash that off, ثم يخرج إلى الصلاة, and that he would leave and then go to the prayer. And so again, as long as the impurity is removed, then you're good enough to go. So this is something that's important. Now, وَأَمَّا الْقَيْء. So as it relates to vomit, yes, these things are important. Because sometimes, I have a kid, my daughter is thrown up on me. So, وَأَمَّا الْقَيْء. So the word that he uses, al-Majjājī, al-Qay, he says, يعني al-batn, meaning the stomach, something that comes up from the stomach. فَلَا يَنْجُسُ مِنْهُ إِلَّا تُغَيِّرْ عَنْ صِفَّةِ الطَّعَامِ. So vomit doesn't become something that causes impurity or needs to be removed, right, in order to perform an act that requires purity, unless one condition. إِلَّا تُغَيِّرُ عَنْ صِفَةِ الطَّعَامِ. Unless it changes character of taste or food, right? He says, بِحُمُوضَ وَنَحْوِهَا. Like if it's very acidic. So you can have a case where a person throws up something, and they just may have thrown up some of the food that they had. Again, it's disgusting, but doesn't necessarily invalidate your purity. Whereas, let's say a person does regurgitate something and it's more like acid reflux, and it's got that nasty, acidic bile taste to it, then yeah, that does, and it needs to be removed from body, the clothing, or the place where the prayer would be performed. So he's saying that as long as, like a baby, for instance, if you feed a baby, anybody here that's had a kid, you feed a baby, it might throw up on you, right? Generally speaking, it's not highly acidic. And so that kind of vomit, it's not an issue. As we might say, grown man vomit that is due to acid reflux, then that would be a difference. So continuing in about the pure and impure substances, وَحُكْمُ فَضَلَاتِ الْحَيْوَانِ. And then the ruling regarding the excretions from animals is that فِي الطهارة والنجاسة, right? The ruling regarding the purity and impurity of animal waste said is going to يَتَّبِعُ حُكْمَ أَكْلِ لَحْمِهِ. It's going to generally following the hukm as it relates to what has been said about the permissibility of its meat. في حل والحرمة والكراهة. So as it relates to it, is that meat permissible? Is it impermissible? Or is it disliked? So we'll go through some examples. يعني أن فضلات الحيوان الذي يباح أكله كالأنعام وهي الإبل والبقر والغنم طاهرة. So he says, for instance, as it relates to those types of excretions that come from animals whose meat is permissible to eat, and those kinds of animals that are permissible for us to eat are things like livestock, chicken, camel, goat, lamb, beef. Because those are tahir, then the fudalat, the excretions from them are generally considered also, they're pure. Now, it might not be pleasant. That's what we were talking about earlier. You have some livestock. Depends on what kind of livestock, or what kind of animal, right? You have some animals and you're stepping in their stuff. If those animals generally are permissible to eat, or if they're from the halal, then their fudalat are considered to be, their excretions are considered to be pure. Again, might not be very pleasant. But again, we differentiate between dirty or nasty or these kinds of terms that we use, kind of like as a vernacular or as a colloquial. And then what does the religion demand from us, right? Which again is a binary of tahir, right? Of ṭahārah and najasa, pure and impure. So that's how we can look there. And then continuing, وفضلة الحيوان المحرم, right? Now those that are haram to eat, كالخنزير والدواب وهي الخيل والبغال والحمير. So those kinds of animals that are considered impermissible to eat, like pig, horses, mules, donkeys. Again, from the Mālikī perspective. Now there may be some other madhahib that allow it, but Malikis, we don't eat horse meat. We're not French. I can't bring myself to eat a horse. Mules, donkeys. Then they're considered najasa. They're considered impure. So you could probably see where it's going. Then as for the excretions from animals that it's disliked but not impermissible to eat. Cats, which are makruh, not haram, but makruh. وسبع البهائم, various wild beasts that are not livestock. طاهرة في الأصل, they're considered pure by default. So even though, because again, like anything else in the religion, when a thing is makruh, when a thing is disliked, when we say something is disliked, like for instance, we can say that it is disliked to stand as a man and urinate. The Prophet ﷺ did so once to demonstrate, but generally the preferred method is to sit down because it's cleaner and such a way. But there's no sin against a person if they do something that is makruh. Eating with the left hand, if you're a right-handed person, or not even just that, but let's say eating with the left hand, period, right? Unless you're doing it as a deliberate intention to disobey or to avoid the sunnah of the Prophet. But let's say you eat something with your left hand or drink with the left hand. Yes, of course, it is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to drink with the right hand and eat with the right hand. But if you did it, there's no ithm. There's no sin against you that you have to ask Allah for forgiveness if you ate with your left hand. Just, I don't know, you're doing something, I took a bite and, oh man, I should eat with my right hand. That's better. But right? So likewise, those things that are considered makruh, those things that are considered disliked, not haram, not inviolable, then they are what? طاهرة fil asl. They're pure by default. So if you're forced to eat a cat, as regrettable that it is, or rather the fadalat, not to eat a cat rather, but let's say your cat throws up on you because it's considered makruh of their flesh, but let's say your cat vomits on you or something like that, or pees on you. I mean, cat urine is really powerful, but it's tahir, it's pure. And so now he's going to mention something here that is also kind of a foundational principle in our usul, or in our study of the foundational principles of how do we comprehend the religion. He says all that about what the types of excretions from animals, the type their flesh is permissible to eat, not permissible to eat, it's disliked. So the reason why when it comes to those animals that it's disliked, like the cat and the da-da-da, he says what? لِأَنَّ الْكَرَاهَةَ, because in the religion, things that are disliked, again, not prohibited, but disliked. لِأَنَّ الْكَرَاهَةَ لَا تَتَنَافِي الْجَوَازِ. They do not preempt or prohibit that which is permissible by default. So just likewise, it is not impermissible to stand and urinate. It's just not like, but maybe by necessity or by situation or circumstance, you have to do so. You don't have to ask Allah for forgiveness. Now, obviously, you have to clean yourself, because al-bawal, the reason why you will notice in this chapter urine will get mentioned quite often is because the Prophet ﷺ said that many of the people of the grave are many who are in the grave that are being subjected to the torture of the grave, which was one of the types of punishments that a person can receive before the Day of Judgment, is due to the fact that they did not clean themselves appropriately after using the bathroom, and most specifically urinating. And so he talked that one time going by a grave of a Jewish man that was buried, and he said that that man is being tortured in the grave by the angels. Why? He said because when he went to the bathroom, he was not careful about cleaning himself, of making istinja, of cleaning himself after using the bathroom. And so one of the ways a person can be tortured in the grave and punished in the grave is just simply not using the bathroom correctly. So whether you stand or sit, you still have to clean yourself appropriately. Right? That's something that's very important. But understand about those things that are makruh, those things that are disliked. And here, when we say disliked, it's not just what I happen to personally dislike, what Matt doesn't really care for, what Ulysses isn't, thrilled about. We're not talking about that type of dislike. This is a technical term that the scholars have said that, we have ascertained that certain actions the Prophet has said, or certain scholars have said, we don't like doing that. But we don't have enough proof to say that it is completely inviolable, and that if a person were to do it, they would have to ask Allah for forgiveness or potentially face punishment in the hereafter. No. And so, لأن الكراهة لا تتنافي الجواز. So this is an important principle in our religion, that which is disliked does not prohibit that which is permissible by default. And things are permissible by default unless there is an extraneous proof otherwise. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ الْحَلَالَ بَيِّنٌ وَالْحَرَامُ بَيِّنٌ وَبَيْنَهُمَا مُتَشَابِهَاتٌ. The Prophet said things are clearly permissible. There are things that are clearly permissible and things that are clearly impermissible. And in between the two of those is a gray area. لَا يَعْرِفُهَا كَثِيرٌ مِنَ النَّاسِ. Most people don't know what that middle gray area is. And so that is one area that we have constructed this third category called the disliked, al-karaha. But we make the differentiation to say that just because a thing is disliked doesn't mean that it's prohibited, just that's it. So that you essentially want to just creating like a black and white scenario. There's halal and haram, permissible, impermissible. No, this doesn't exist. There is a third area. Okay, ولكن تكره الصلاة بها. So rather, it is disliked. Now you get into your question about the animals, and you got walking in their stuff, right? He says ولكن تكره الصلاة بها في الثياب أو البدن. Right. So it is disliked for the musalli. It is disliked for the person that's going to pray to do the prayer in a clothing or garment or on their body of which such substances are present. ولكن تكره الصلاة بها في الثياب وفي البدن على بقعة الأرض, or even to perform the prayer on a patch of earth or where that stuff might be present, or it's disliked. If it is what is مخالطة لها, if it's kind of mixed up in there, it's disliked to do it. But if you were forced to by obligation, prayer's about to go out, I have to pray, well, then in that case, the karaha takes second seat to the obligation, right? The disliked takes a second seat, a back seat to the obligation to perform the prayer. But I mean, obviously these are some pretty exceptional circumstances, but something important to remember nonetheless, that if you happen to find yourself in those set of circumstances, then that's what you got to do. You have to perform the prayer. But it is disliked to do them, and therefore, what's the implication out of that? If you can, change your clothes. If you can, wash your body. If you can, change where you're going to pray. That would be preferable, because it is disliked to do so. Because it is kind of disgusting. That's going to take us up to the next chapter that will begin next week when we meet, the Bab Izalat al-Najasa. This will be the chapter that will deal specifically of how to remove impurities, whether it is through water or other means. Like, how do we deal specifically with the removing of impurities? Salawatullahi ta'ala ala nabihi al-kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.